From the Homestead Studios in Santa Clarita, California, this is a Headache Soul production. Welcome to Just the Tip-Sters, America's favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Morgan. And if you have a tip on a missing person or unsolved homicide, or you just want to suggest a case that we should cover, please consider emailing us at jttipsters@gmail.com. You can call us at 832-TIPSTER. That's 832-847-7837. And you can find us on any social media platform. We have a Just the Tipsters Facebook page. You can find us at JT Tipsters on Instagram, at JT Tipsters Pod on Twitter. Just consider giving that a whirl. And if you have a moment and you like the content that we make, if you are enjoying the cases we're covering here, consider giving us a rating or review on your favorite platform where you listen to this podcast. We would greatly appreciate it. It means the world to us. Apparently, that is how other people find us, and Lord knows we can use some finding. So interesting news from the true crime world. This week, Tony Sirico died. He was Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos, and he was very open about being connected to the Colombo crime family, like deeply connected. And I'm not sure how somebody gets out of that life and into acting, but I know that he had originally auditioned for the role of Uncle Junior, that, Dominique Chianese got that role. And David Chase, the creator of The Sopranos, loved Tony Sirico so much he invented the role of Paulie Walnuts for him. And Paulie Walnuts was like the Norm Crosby of, the mafia underworld. And most of you are too young to know what the fuck that means. But Norm Crosby was a popular talk show guest and on game shows back before your grandparents were born, because he was kind of the king of malaprops. And Paulie Walnuts would, like to quote philosophers, like he said, Sun Tzu instead of Sun Tzu, who wrote, The Art of War. Anyway, I don't know how somebody becomes an actor, but you know what? Especially if you're deeply embedded in the Colombo crime family, if little Stevie can play with Bruce Springsteen and then become Silvio, who, spoiler alert, kills Adriana, I guess Tony Sirico can become an actor. And, people tell you who they are, even fictional people. And Christopher told Adriana, look, I'm a soldier. And when people tell you who they are, you believe them, right? I'm struggling with that myself right now with actual real human beings. But episode 218, the Krista Helm unsolved homicide, we know Tony Sirico was at least acquainted with Krista because he shows up to her shared apartment that she shares with her roommate after she's found murdered in a driveway in West Hollywood. He takes Krista's fur coat and some other items that perhaps somebody from the Colombo crime family may have purchased for her. I don't know. It's just interesting to me when someone who is associated with an unsolved homicide, after they die and nothing has happened to them, and you wonder if there's another part of this journey, if there's another place we go to, maybe they meet up. Tony Sirico allegedly, not even allegedly, he totally admitted he was in the Colombo crime family, but he, not allegedly, he showed up. He showed up. I'm trying to keep myself from being sued. He shows up at Krista Helm's apartment and removes some items after she's been murdered. And then he becomes an actor on The Sopranos. So interesting life. And there's been no cause of death listed, but he had been living in an assisted living facility in Fort Lauderdale. And his manager, Bob McGowan, said he'd been suffering from dementia for the last few years. He was 79. And a small update, I started a job this week that is threatening to suck the soul out of my bones. And the building where I work requires that we wear masks. It's a governmental federal building. And a man came in and said that we are trying to kill him because he has COPD and he cannot wear a mask. And I told him he could absolutely take the mask off. I had no problem. It's not my rule. You know what? I didn't make the rules. Take the mask off, sir. If it's that difficult for you, take the mask off. That was my first mistake, because he then chose to tell me that the pandemic isn't real, that he had toured all of the hospitals in Los Angeles and they were empty. I mean, that seems like a lot of touring for someone with COPD, but God bless him. Maybe, he has a rascal, or he's just hardy. He doesn't look hardy. And he said that he had active COVID patients cough directly into his mouth because that's how you build immunity. And I didn't bother to argue with him that I don't know why he needed immunity for a pandemic that doesn't exist. But you know what? I just let him go on. He told me that every hospital gets $1 million for anyone who dies while on a ventilator. So don't let them put you on a ventilator. That is sure death, which, it's not sure death because some people actually get off of them. I get it. By the time you are put on a ventilator, it may be too late and you much more chance of infection. I get it. He said that the only cure for the virus that doesn't exist is for the imaginary pandemic is honey and colloidal silver. So I'm not saying QAnon, because you know what? This is not a political podcast, but I'm just going to tell you everyone has a right to believe what they want to believe. I just don't have to agree with it. This case is really fascinating to me. Connie Converse was 50 years old when she disappeared in 1974. No trace of her has ever been found. It's a real mystery, and some of the details being because of the time that this happened. Some of the reasoning could be that the family wanted to protect her privacy, and we're going to get into the details. And I just wanted to say that the person who would have loved this case more than anyone else was Mark Humphreys. Mark, who toured the entire U.S. from 1995 to 2005 as a singer-songwriter. He, had a record label, Trough Records, that he started for himself, and it grew to have 11 artists and bands. He would have loved this case. He may have even known who Connie Converse was. I would love to talk to him for so many reasons, but this case, I feel like this is a gift from Tipster Debbie. And Tipster Debbie is a friend to the podcast. She is a Patreon subscriber. She posted this case on her Facebook timeline, and I became fascinated. And I said, hey, do you mind if I cover this case? And she said, not at all. And Debbie was fascinated by this case because it happened in her hometown of Laconia, New Hampshire. And she felt like she should have known the case. It's a small town, 18,000 people. And she, had never heard of the case, but I think it's because she's too young to have heard of the case. But, this episode was very personal for me. I cried my eyes out just listening to Connie's music. There's a short documentary of her life called Talking Like You. And it's on YouTube. And, she has there are family members. The filmmaker is a lovely woman, Andrea Canis, and she has cobbled together this documentary with, pictures of Connie, some of her recordings, interviews with the family members that are left, interviews with friends that are left. It's the case is pretty old, right? It's, 1974 is when she disappeared, right after she turned 50. But her songs are so unique. I mean, everything I heard and read about her, it reminds me of that Henry David Thoreau quote that I heard as a child that just gutted me, which is, it's a crappy way to think about life, but it's the mass of men live lives of quiet desperation. And I love one of the interpretations is that we need to follow our passion and achieve a life which avoids mediocrity. We shouldn't play small. And Connie tried this and it didn't go well. And that's kind of heartbreaking. It is encouraging that people are discovering her talent, 50 years later. So it's she is a unique creature, but, sometimes talent alone isn't enough. And I sure don't think it's because Connie didn't work hard enough. She spent 16 years in Greenwich Village, and a lot of people in the industry were fans of hers. And she's largely considered the first singer-songwriter. I think that's fascinating. A woman, you know? This was before folk music was really getting a lot of attention. I just feel like everyone keeps describing her as before her time. And I feel like that's a cruel joke, you know? She really had some things going for her, and it was heartbreaking that they didn't pan out. At one point, she was even on the morning news with Walter Cronkite. And I think that would be a pretty big deal in 1952. I became a little bit obsessed with this case. You know, I thought I was going to talk about one thing, and it turns out I'm talking about a few other things. I thought I was going to be covering this woman's case who disappeared kind of due to weird circumstances, and I really wanted to blame someone else. And the truth is, I still don't know what happened to her, but I really lean more toward that she disappeared herself. Her family seems to believe that, and she did a lot of things that would make you think maybe she did, you know. She left her diary and a filing cabinet and a lot of information about herself, and these were not discovered until years after she had disappeared, and it seems almost like she was planning that long after she is gone, maybe her family would be afforded some riches because of her talent. But I know it doesn't surprise anyone that I cried my eyes out, but it was more tears of joy at her work just existing in the world. And I'm just going to tell you right now, I am not a fan of her voice. It's sometimes very interesting and sometimes it's very odd, but it's got a very distinct timbre and cadence. And there are many more singers that are, you know, much more talented, but her songwriting is so very unique. Her phrasing, her cadence, it's very unique. There's no one like her. It bothers me when people, including myself, compare her to someone else. She could literally be one of the first people to ever use a 4-track recorder and overdub her own voice in different tracks. Like, she might be the original overdubber. And I feel like journalists have tried to really pigeonhole her whole life, but she's just too unique. A few of her songs have been put on an album in vinyl form. That makes me very happy. The song that I love the most has a bunch of different titles. It could be called Between Two Big Mountains. It could be called The Squirrel Song. It's my favorite, and it's going to be played a little later in this episode. And not to get too inside baseball, like with the whole designated hitter rule, because I don't really know shit about fuck when it comes to singer-songwriters or baseball, but she's just different. She was just unique. Her chord progressions are interesting. Her phrasing is haunting. It's the only word I can use is haunting. The changes in her songs are, you know, journalists like compared her to like Joan Baez and Joni Mitchell. And someone said it's if Sylvia Plath and Bob Dylan had had a baby. And I sort of think if Dorothy Parker's writing was set to music. But you know what? That even feels like a cheap comparison to me. It's almost a dismissal of her uniqueness. It sounds trite, you know, and that's the last thing I want to be. One of my favorite comments from the online sleuthing community said something like her songs would be perfect for Kate Bush. And, you know, God bless her. Please don't send me hate mail. I don't want it. Life is hard enough right now for me, and I don't need your shit comments. And I'm allowed to have an opinion. If you want to start your own Kate Bush as a Goddess podcast, just have at it. I am not a fan. And Kate Bush is having a revival of sorts, which irks me to no fucking end, because the finale of Stranger Things, her song Running Up That Hill, was played, and I don't get her. I just want to let you know, I am not a neophyte here, okay? I hosted a music radio show in the early 90s in Cincinnati on WOXY. It was an alternative station, and I found out about John Cale and the New York Dolls and Morrissey and Concrete Blonde, and I loved a lot of that shit. And then there was Kate Bush, and I was like, I don't get it. And all of these people were, you know, oh my God, she's incredible. And I'm like, meh, whatever. And I tried. Please know I tried. I kept going back to her videos to see if maybe a visual representation of her songs would make it better for me. I am very auditory. I am not very visual. I'm definitely much more auditory. But listening to her stuff and watching her videos really didn't make a difference. I found her dramatic for no reason, very overwrought, overdone. It was like she was the 80s version of Mariah Carey, like very operatic for no reason. And it would be like if, somebody like Laurie Anderson were boring and ordinary. And look, you know what? I said what I said. So this is an abrupt left turn. WOXY was famously mentioned in Rain Man by Dustin Hoffman. So the movie Rain Man was filmed in Cincinnati. I have no idea why, except maybe it was cheaper. And there's a famous scene where Tom Cruise is driving with Valeria Golino and Dustin Hoffman's in the backseat as Raymond. And they're in a convertible, I think. And they're going over the Brent Spence Bridge that connects Ohio to Kentucky across the Ohio River. And Dustin Hoffman is making noises mimicking the whine of the tires on the bridge, on the suspension bridge. And a promo for a radio station comes on the air, and it says, 97X, pew, the future of rock and roll. And Raymond mimics that, and that was the radio station I worked at. And it was... It was the Great Radio Wars of Cincinnati, because there was a very large rock station, WEBN, which still exists, and WOXY still exists. WOXY was 5,000 watts, and WEBN is probably 50,000. It's the big hammer in town. But the producers picked WOXY, and it was a thing of beauty. It really, back then it was pretty big shit. So comparing Connie to anyone else really doesn't do her justice, because she was an individual talent. I mean, her ideas, her songwriting, the short documentary, which I said was called Talking Like You. It's also called We Lived Alone. It's called a lot of things. That's one of the things that I think makes it difficult to find stuff. But if you just Google Connie Converse, you're going to get hopefully good information if you want to know about her. Andrea Canis put together, old interviews, and she ended up using the documentary for her media studies thesis at, I think, NYU. A friend helped her write a grant, and she did some crowdfunding, and I think it came out like 2016. And it has appeared in some film festivals, and like I said, you can find it on YouTube. And it's it's very short. It might be 40 minutes long. And I really just fell down a rabbit hole when Tipster Debbie told me about this case, because I had never heard of her, had never heard the case, didn't know, was unfamiliar with her music. It's a great story. And there aren't a lot of records, that you can find about someone who disappeared in 1974. This brilliant woman that clearly wanted to disappear. But Elizabeth Eaton Converse was born in Laconia, New Hampshire in 1924. She grew up in Concord, New Hampshire, and she was the middle child of a very strict Baptist family. Her father was a Baptist minister, and he left that ministry and headed up a state chapter of the Anti-Saloon League. They were trying to keep prohibition in place. She attended Concord High School, and she was the valedictorian. She won 8 different academic awards. She was awarded a scholarship, a 4-year scholarship to Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. And her mother and grandmother have both gone there, and they were just overjoyed. But after 2 years, she left Mount Holyoke and moved to New York. It's, the 1950s, and she worked in the Academy Photo Offset Printing House in the Flatiron District and lived in Greenwich Village. And she was given a nickname by coworkers of Connie Converse. So they stopped calling her Elizabeth or Liz. And she began writing songs and then performing them for friends. And she learned to accompany herself on a guitar. And her music came to be noticed by this cartoonist, animator. And he drew cartoons for music magazines. And he was an amateur recording engineer. His name's Gene Deitch. And he made tape recordings of people like John Lee Hooker and Pete Seeger as early as the 1940s. And Gene is interviewed in the documentary, and he's a pretty fascinating guy. He made a number of recordings of Connie in the kitchen of his house in Hastings-on-Hudson in the mid-1950s. But she just didn't catch on. And he is the reason that she was on the morning show on CBS with Walter Cronkite, because he helped arrange that. And she got to sing a couple of songs, which back then would have been pretty huge. And she signed something for Gene Deitch that said, "With love and modest pride, Elizabeth Converse," even though she was, known professionally as Connie. It's 1961, and she has not caught on, and she is despondent. And she moves away from New York after 16 years of trying to become a famous singer-songwriter. And I'm not going to call her a folk singer, because when you hear her song, and if you look for any of her other ones, which I urge you to do, because of their raw, authentic beauty. They're short. They're all about 3 minutes long or under, and her turn of a phrase she's mesmerizing. So in 1961, she leaves New York and moves to Ann Arbor, Michigan, because her brother, Philip, her younger brother Philip, was now a professor of political science at the University of Michigan. And he got her a job as the managing editor of the Journal of Conflict Resolution. And she loved it at first, but it was apparently very stressful and very taxing. And she started drinking and smoking heavily. And her only involvement in the musical world was playing for friends and at parties. It's like she slipped further and further into depression. Apparently she had a difficult time saying no. Her mother said, "Look, your grandmother and I are going on a trip to Alaska. We want you to go with us." And she couldn't say no. And as her younger brother, Philip, remembers her getting into the cab as they go to the airport, and she's smoking, and she hangs her head out the window and blows a puff of smoke toward Philip and says, "I'd like to go to Alaska, but I'd like to stay in the basement," which I think that sums up a lot of us. I think I'd like to stay in the basement, but you don't have basements in California because of earthquakes. So anyway, her friends had gotten together a fund because they knew she was really slipping, and sent her on a 6-month trip to England. And she did enjoy it. She wrote in her journal that the trip meant so much to her that she actually experienced what she thought was happiness. Now, the fact that she has to think that's what happiness feels like is pretty hard to hear. But I think that might let you know where her brain was. So she had been told by doctors that she needed a hysterectomy, and they called it very major surgery. And she had just turned 50. And even though she, was very private about her life, her idea of love, no one remembers her having a relationship. Several people have posited she may have been gay, but no one knows for sure. Her brother said even though she was 50 and had not had kids and was going to have a hysterectomy, she had always wanted children. So that had to be devastating. So she's faced with this surgery. Her career didn't go how she wanted it to go. So right after her 50th birthday in August of 1974, she writes a series of letters to family and friends, the people that she cares about the most. And she says she's going to make a new life for herself somewhere else. I think that is thinly veiled and not the truth, but by the time that they had all gotten their letters, she'd already packed her Volkswagen Beetle and driven away, and she has never been heard from again. She mentioned, many times to her nephew that she had dreamed about getting a non-stressful job, like working as a cashier at Woolworth, so she could just come home and leave the job there, because, she's one of those people that no matter what job you have, you bring it home, you think about it, you worry about it, you think about it when you're not at work, you think about ways to make it better, to streamline it. And I know who she is because I'm that person too. Even a job you don't want or don't care about, you spend your off time thinking about what you could do to make it better. So what's heartbreaking is that her parents never heard one of her songs. They did not see her Walter Cronkite morning show appearance. And Jean Deitch just said, you know what, we really tried, we just couldn't sell her. So it's now January of 2004, and Jean Deitch is 80 years old and living in Prague, and he had moved there in 1961. And he is invited to be a guest on a show hosted by music historian David Garland called Spinning on Air. And they use some of the footage of that show in the documentary. And David Garland is like, you know, Jean Deitch sent me a whole bunch of recordings. A lot of it was like Czech Papa bands, and that he was just so taken with. And I was like, yeah, whatever. And in the middle is one of Connie's songs. And David Garland is like, wow, this is blowing me away right now. And two of the listeners to David Garland's show, Dan Zula and David Herman, were so inspired that they put together an album of Connie's music. They're the ones that, you know, put her music to an album form. And there's two sources. That's the tapes from Jean Deitch, and her brother Philip gave them, you know, collections of the recordings that she had sent him in the 50s when she was in New York. By March of 2009, How Sad, How Lovely, which is one of her songs I encourage you to listen to, comes out as an album and contains 17 songs by Connie Converse. And, you know, I thought I was going to be talking about something else. And I end up talking about this woman's career. And she's this fascinating human being. In a note that she had sent to her brother, she said, "Human society fascinates me, awes me, and fills me with grief and joy. I just can't find my place to plug into it." And you know what, Connie? I bet there's a lot of us that can identify with that. I know a lot of artists do, for sure. So along with packing up her Volkswagen Beetle right after her 50th birthday, she wrote a check to her brother Phil and said, "Can you please keep up my health insurance for a certain amount of time, and then don't worry about it after a certain date?" And people have asked why the police haven't looked more closely into her disappearance. And the truth is, there's no law against disappearing. And we've all heard stories of someone disappearing because of, you know, a responsibility like debt or a family they don't want, but it isn't against the law. Her family had hired a private investigator who said to them, "I will try to find her, but hearing her story, I think she wanted to disappear." And her family just took that and decided they would respect her wishes. There has been no use of her social security number. The name Elizabeth Converse appeared in 2 different phone books in the 60s and 70s. No. The name Elizabeth Converse appeared in phone books in Kansas City and Oklahoma in the 70s and 80s. But her brother Phil could not bear to contact those women because he said that leaving was her decision and he wanted to respect that. A close friend of Connie's had committed suicide when they were kids. And even back then, Connie told her brother that it was a very personal decision to take one's own life, and it should be left up to the individual whether or not to live. And I think that's a very unusual, forward way of thinking. I mean, she definitely was ahead of her time. So the final recording in this documentary is a place called Lonesome Lake, and Connie mentions it in a song, and the filmmaker Andrea Canis went with her then boyfriend, who's now her husband, on a 45-minute hike up a hill. And she said she didn't prepare. She didn't bring enough water. Her then boyfriend injured his ankle. They were fighting. And she said once they got to the top of the hill, she felt like Connie. She felt defeated. She wasn't any good at filmmaking. She just wanted to give up. But she took out her camera and shot some footage, and that ended up being in the documentary, and it's beautiful. And the song, can be called by a lot of different titles. Between Two Big Mountains, Talkin' Like You, that's my favorite, because it's TALKIN apostrophe, which I really like when people shorten things like talking to talkin' like you. I don't know why, I'm a weirdo. I do it all the time in written notes or messages to people. And the other title is the Squirrel Thing song, and I think you'll like that one. Connie's family truly believes that she drove her Volkswagen into a body of water. And I know there's a lot of bodies of water in and around Michigan. And I know without a direction to go, a favorite place for her to be, it would be difficult for organizations like Adventures with Purpose to find her. I had this daydream that, somebody finds her and her Volkswagen in Lonesome Lake, and then we finally know what happens to her. Or maybe she did do what she dreamed of when she was frustrated and started a new small life somewhere. But I tend to think like her family, that she drove her car into a body of water. And maybe we'll never know for sure. But if you have any information on the whereabouts of Elizabeth Connie Converse, I hope you'll consider calling us on the Tipster hotline at 832-TIPSTER. That's 832-847-7837. Or email us at jttipsters@gmail.com.
In between two tall mountains, there's a place they call Lonesome. Don't see why they call it lonesome. I'm never lonesome when I go there. See that bird sitting on my windowsill? Well, he's saying whippoorwill all the night through. See that brook running by my kitchen door? Well, it couldn't talk no more if it was you. Up that tree there's sort of a squirrel thing, sounds just like we did when we were quarreling. In the yard I keep a pig or two, they drop in for dinner like you used to do. I don't stand in the need of company, with everything I see talking like you. Up that tree there's sort of a squirrel thing, sounds just like we did when we were quarreling. You may think you left me all alone, but I can hear you talk without a telephone. I don't stand in the need of company, with everything I see talking like you. See that bird sitting on my windowsill? Well, he's saying whippoorwill all the night through, just whippoorwill all the night through. In between two tall mountains there's a place they call Lonesome. Don't see why they call it lonesome. I'm never lonesome, now I live there.
When did you write that? How did you happen to get that